Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 19th Annual Conference of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. My name is Asma Afsaruddin, and I'm the chair of the Board of Directors of CSID. As many of you know, our conference is a much anticipated annual event in Washington, D.C., which addresses critical topics of democracy and democratization in the context of various Muslim-majority societies. The Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy is a nonprofit institution studying Islamic and democratic political thought and merging them into a modern Islamic democratic discourse. The organization was founded in Washington, D.C. in March 1999 by a diverse group of academicians, professionals, and activists, both Muslim and non-Muslim, from around the USA, who agreed on the need for the study and dissemination of reliable information on this complex topic. We also now have a branch in Tunis, Tunisia, where CSID has been very active in promoting grassroots support for democracy among various sectors and maintains a very dynamic agenda of hosting lectures and symposia on Islamic democratic thoughts and practices and related matters. The title of our conference today is Authoritarianism and Democratic Decline in the Age of Sectarianism and Populism. These are topics that are very much on the front burner today. Sectarianism raises its ugly head in significant parts of the Middle East, while a tidal wave of populism sweeps through not only the MENA region, but also through much of Europe and the United States, leading many to wonder if this augurs the gradual erosion of liberal democratic values worldwide and the rise of a global trend of political authoritarianism. Our conference today will be exploring these fraught topics and reflecting upon where we are headed in such an age. Our first morning panel will focus on the topic of Egypt and the contradictions of liberalism. This will be followed by a panel on piety or politics, interpreting the Iran-Saudi rivalry and the rise of sectarianism. Next will be our luncheon keynote address to be given by the well-known Saudi columnist, activist, and author Jamal Khashoggi, who will be speaking on why the Arab world needs democracy now more than ever, an obviously timely as well as a provocative topic. This will be followed by a keynote panel that will focus on Turkey and is titled, "Where is Turkey Headed? Assessing the State of Democracy in Turkey." Following the luncheon address and the keynote panel, we have an afternoon session on Tunisia called Challenges to Democratic Consolidation in Tunisia. Tunisia, of course, remains the one success story to have emerged out of the Arab Spring. Yet there remain significant challenges to the democratic processes that are underway there, challenges that will occupy the attention of our panelists. The late afternoon sessions in the 4 to 5 p.m. time slot are two parallel sessions. One is titled U.S. Foreign Policy, Neoliberalism, and the Pact Theory, and the other is Islamic Politics, Populism, and Coalition Building. We will then have concluding remarks by Dr. Radwan Masmoudi, the president of CSID, at the end of the day. Now, to kick us off, I invite to the podium for making some introductory remarks the program committee chair for this year, Dr. Nader Hashmi, whose Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver is co-sponsoring this event with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 19th annual conference. Assalamu alaikum. Ahlan wa sahlan. Our Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver is very honored and proud to be co-sponsoring this conference. This is the third time that we are co-sponsoring a conference with the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, and that's largely because the work that the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy has been pursuing overlaps almost exactly with the research focus of our academic center at the University of Denver, which is really to study the relationship between religion, democracy, and Muslim majority societies. But of course, as we gather here to study the question of democracy in Muslim-majority societies, it's important to sort of just remind ourselves of the very dark, depressing, and really disappointing landscape that sort of envelops this conversation about democracy in Muslim-majority societies. These are very dark and depressing times indeed. A few weeks ago, the Economist Intelligence Unit published its 10th edition of its Democracy Index, which is a comprehensive ranking of nations around the world that measures their commitment and progress towards democracy. And for the second consecutive year, the United States of America failed to be ranked in the top bracket as a full democracy and was grouped in the second category of flawed democracy. So one of the very challenging and disappointing aspects of having a conversation about democracy in the Arab and Islamic world is that while that region of the world has been a constant focus for this center and for the work that we do at the University of Denver, now we're confronted with the problem of global decline of democracy on a massive scale, including in this country. And it's not just the policies of Donald Trump that are of concern here. We're actually seeing a connection between the rise of authoritarianism in the West, linking up and reinforcing and strengthening authoritarian trends in the Arab Islamic world. And so when you survey the region that concerns us here, there's a lot to be depressed about. There's a lot to be angry about. But we soldier on. We want to continue to sort of talk about these issues, to continue to analyze these issues, because at the end of the day, this myth of authoritarian stability, this myth that somehow the interests of the West, the security of the West can be preserved by putting your faith in and trying to sustain authoritarian regimes is a recipe for greater disaster and disappointment. I mean, if there's one lesson to be learned from the Arab Spring is that if these authoritarian regimes were so successful and so able to preserve political order, they would not have erupted into revolutions to begin with. And so we're here to try and understand this particular topic in all of its dimensions. We have a number of excellent panels set up. We can't cover every single topic. Asma just went through some of the key panels. I have the honor of having a conversation at 11 o'clock to try and examine one of the key issues that I think is at the root of the instability in the region today, and that is the regional rivalry between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that seems to be heading us toward war in the coming months. And I look forward to having a conversation with our panelists. I just want to end by saying that we view this conference very much as a public group effort. In other words, each of the panels will have time reserved for audience questions and answers. So please take advantage of that opportunity to contribute to the conversations that we're having here up on the stage. We value your input. We look forward to your input. And we wish you all a very successful conference. Thank you all for coming. And I'll turn the floor over to Radwan for the transition to the next panel. Or should we just begin with the next panel? We'll begin with the next panel, which focuses on the topic of Egypt. And so we're very lucky to have the editors of a very important book with us here today, Egypt and the Contradictions of Liberalism. This is going to examine one of the most important countries in the Middle East. So I'll turn the floor over to Dalia Fahmy and Daanish Faruqi to start us off.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being up and awake so early in the morning. So our first panel covers Egypt. It's titled after a book that Daanish and I co-edited, but the scope of the panel goes far beyond that. And so I'm going to quickly introduce all of our panelists, They will speak in very broad context about several issues, and then for about 10 minutes each, and then we will open the floor to Q&A. So we're going to start off by my colleague, Daanish Faruqi, who's a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers. He's a former Fulbright scholar in Morocco. He has over 5 years of combined experience living in the MENA region as a resident researcher and journalist, which gave rise to 2 books, Egypt and the Contradictions of Liberalism, with like the world's coolest co-editor. And the second, from Camp David to Cast-led, essays on Israel, Palestine, the future of the peace process. He's presently based in Cairo, where his fieldwork focuses, Morocco, where his fieldwork focuses on the Syrian revolution and the role of transnational Sufi rebel groups in giving rise to the uprising. He's also a PhD candidate at Duke University. Our second speaker is Andrew Miller, who is the Deputy Director for Foreign Policy at the Project on Mideast Democracy and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has nearly 10 years of experience working on the Middle East for the US government and has conducted extensive research on multiple countries in the region. From 2014 to 2017, he served as the Director of Egypt and Israel on military issues on national security, where he was responsible for coordinating US policy towards each of these countries. While at the NSC, Andrew was deeply involved in the Obama administration's efforts to modernize US military assistance to Egypt. He's also participated as a member of the US delegation that negotiated a 10-year memorandum of understanding on security assistance to Israel, the largest aid agreement in US history. He's also worked at the Department of State on a variety of political and analytical roles, such as to the Middle East, serving at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, and at the US embassies in Doha and Cairo. His latest article appears in Foreign Affairs on Egypt's sham elections. Our next speaker is Professor Amy Austin Holmes, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at the American University of Cairo and a fellow here at the Wilson Center of International Center for Scholars. She's been awarded fellowships from Harvard, Brown, and was a Fulbright scholar in Germany. Her research focuses on the intersection of contentious politics and security issues. Her book, Social Unrest and American Military Bases in Turkey and Germany since 1945, was published by Cambridge University Press. Having spent a decade living in the Middle East through the period known as the Arab Spring, she's published numerous articles on Egypt, Turkey, Bahrain, and the Kurdish regions of Iraq and Syria. Her latest op-ed appeared 6 days ago in the Washington Post, asking what Egypt's racist campaign against the Nubians says about the Sisi regime. And finally, at the end of our panel, we have Mohammed al-Manshawi, who is a Washington-based foreign affairs columnist for Egypt's daily Al-Shuruq with a regular column. He previously held senior positions with a few Arab media outlets such as Al-Arabi TV, Arab Insight, and Tahrir Washington. And for 4 years was a resident scholar at the Mideast Institute here in DC. His last piece was on Mohammed bin Salman's visit to the United States, which appeared in Al Jazeera, and he's testified at the Committee on Homeland Security covering Sinai. So as you can tell, we have a very dynamic panel who is well-versed on this issue, and we're going to begin with Daanish Faruqi setting the stage for the conversation. He will speak for about 10 minutes. I'll give you a wave when it's time to stop, and then we'll move beyond that. Thanks again.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, first of all, to CSID for this opportunity and for arranging this dynamic discussion. Thank you in advance for my distinguished colleagues. So insofar as this panel is titled Egypt and the Contradictions of Liberalism, it is at least loosely based on the book of the same title I published alongside Professor Fahmy a little over a year ago with considerable fanfare and success, which goes into great detail about the failures of Egyptian liberal activists and intellectuals in giving rise to the counter-revolution of 2013. But rather than offer an explication of the book's core thesis here, as Dalia and I have done in lectures and talks all over the world over the past several months, I thought it astute today, in the aftermath of the latest presidential elections, to offer an impromptu afterword of sorts, sort of like, where are they now with regard to the illiberal intelligentsia that informed our intervention? To prepare for doing so, I did some considerable reading of thoughts and commentaries made by some key liberal figures in the election's aftermath, particularly in the Arabic language press. And despite these figures being disparate and unique in background, profession, and aims, I found some shocking unifying threads in their comportment. I'll start with Dr. Mohammed Abdelghar, the physician activist and co-founder of the March 9th Movement for University Independence in Egypt. Briefly, as we articulated in our book, Dr. Abdelghar transitioned from his role as founder of the Egyptian Social Democratic Party following the 2011 uprising to a stalwart supporter of President Sisi in the lead up to and events following July 2013. Continuing to refer to Sisi as Egypt's redeemer in the years that followed, his criticisms of the president had been largely limited to economic concerns. In the aftermath of the latest presidential elections, though, Abdelghar is eerily silent. In an article written in Al-Masr al-Yawm in the week leading up to the election, titled Al-Fan wa-Tib am al-Intikhabat, the arts and medicine or the election, Abdelghar goes as far as respond to his critics' frustration that he did not write about the elections as such. He responds stating that he would prefer to direct his prose to matters that actually stand to uplift the people of Egypt and increase the welfare of the country he so deeply loves, which in his view would be more appropriately channeled in the arts, spending the rest of his piece commenting on the Egyptian art scene in Dubai. Through their mastery of the arts, Abdelghar maintains, the people of Egypt can take control over their own history and destiny. Essentially then, the good doctor relies on a red herring, waxing poetic about high culture in order to avoid taking meaningful responsibility for the very political moment he directly helped enable. We see the same in the case of the prominent writer and journalist Ibrahim Isa. Like Abdelghar, one of the most avant-garde journalists in Egypt, has offered nothing by way of commentary on arguably the most important political moment in Egypt since 2013. Instead, he spent the election week dedicating his time to the work of the recently deceased Egyptian writer Ahmed Khaled Tawfiq, going as far as dedicating a full show of his radio program, in other words, to the life and career of the novelist. Additionally, he offers explications on Egyptian cinema during the election period. Now, to be fair, this isn't entirely outside of his job description as a media personality and an intellectual, but for an avowedly political journalist to refrain entirely from commenting on a key political moment facing the nation, a political moment he, in his commentary over the past several years, directly helped enable, suggests a breathtaking abdication of responsibility and dereliction of duty. From here, I'll move to Geber Asfour, the Egyptian novelist and cultural critic who forms a case study in one of our book's most intriguing chapters. Like Ibrahim Isa, Asfour spent part of the election week similarly expressing his sympathies at the passing of the novelist Ahmed Khaled Tawfiq. Now, this is less surprising for Asfour, whereas figures like Abdelghar and Isa are palpably political figures. Asfour is first and foremost a litterateur. But it is his role as a cultural critic that, unlike his erstwhile colleagues, gives Geber Asfour rise to him making avowedly political explications. Keep in mind, Asfour was no armchair intellectual, but a former minister of culture, first under the stewardship of Ahmed Shafiq's transitional government in 2011, a role that he endured much rebuke at the time for accepting, and for which he resigned in 10 days citing health concerns, and then again in 2014 and 2015 under President Sisi. Recent interviews in the lead-up to and aftermath of the 2018 elections have Asfour strongly emphasizing the cultural health of the nation and the need to radically overhaul education to help Egypt overcome the intellectual impasse facing its citizenry, in a project he, as Minister of Culture, tried to spearhead, which he termed Toward a New Cultural Paradigm, warning that Egypt is currently undergoing a difficult and heavy transitional phase. In a recent interview with Al-Masr al-Yawm, Asfour laments a lack of response from the government to properly support the resuscitation of Egyptian culture through media, the educational system, or otherwise. And in that context, in another interview, he actually goes as far as acknowledge the limitations of the electoral process, questioning why it did not have a series of competing candidates per a true democratic atmosphere. Yet despite acknowledging that degradation of the Egyptian democratic atmosphere, Asfour nonetheless acquiesces to precisely that degradation, maintaining that, quote, because of the exceptional circumstances in Egypt, we should postpone this request, that being of robust democratic elections, to the next presidency. Now, what are those exceptional circumstances to which Asfour speaks? As far as he is concerned, the imminent threat posed by the Muslim Brotherhood to Egyptian society, particularly on Egyptian culture, necessitates that we presently excuse the erosion of the rule of law in Egypt, or at least postpone it until the threat of Islamism is first properly extirpated. So enduring is that threat, Asfour warns elsewhere, that he rejected calls for reconciliation with the Brotherhood and its sympathizers on the premise that, quote, it is impossible to reconcile with those who killed my brother and son. Indeed, in his conversation with El Masr al-Yom, Asfour admits having voted for Sisi in the latest election, trusting, quote, that Sisi will be able to change the situation. The man has made real achievements to which we should pay tribute, end quote. Those real achievements, however, have not to date sufficiently addressed investing in Egyptian culture in general or Asfour's project of toward a new cultural paradigm in particular. And so long as Sisi adequately makes these necessary investments in Egyptian high culture, it follows Asfour is willing to trust the president in his ongoing offensive on civil society. So here we see an interesting phenomenon in that Egyptian high culture is being offered as a subterfuge for avowedly political activists and commentators like Abul Ghar and Ibrahim Isa, whose careers would otherwise obligate them to weigh in on the elections in some capacity. We see a retreat into cultural matters, quite literally in the case of Abul Ghar, as a stand-in for the political, hiding behind the exalted realm of the high arts to essentially elide their political commitments which, as our book astutely chronicles, directly help give rise to the current authoritarian order in place in Egypt. And on the flip side, we see politics being addressed more directly by cultural critics, who go so far as rely on the same exalted status of Egyptian high culture as a basis to directly and unequivocally justify Sisi's repressive regime. In both cases, liberals under consideration have weaponized the lofty status of high culture in the arts, either to elide their responsibility in giving rise to the current political climate in Egypt, or to outright lend it their continuing support even 5 years later. At face value, then, it seems that liberals in Egypt have learned nothing since the elections of 2011 and 2013. An enduring reminder that, per the premises of our book, that their project remains deeply elitist and one mired in breathtaking contradictions at its inception, and that a viable liberal alternative in Egyptian politics will necessitate rethinking the project and its ultimate aims. Needless to say, even a year later, the contradictions of liberalism in Egypt continue to endure. With that, I'll end here. Thank you very much.